I want to kill my daughter. I never believed in the existence of inherently bad seeds until my daughter was born. When she was 2, my mother-in-law was feeding her. She said, "Baby, I'll take a bite of your banana," and my daughter directly stabbed her in the eye with chopsticks. My mother-in-law wasn't prepared and ended up in the hospital. When my husband teased her about taking away her toy, she smashed it on the ground and screamed while stomping on the pieces. At 4, a friend's child came over to play. For some reason, the 2 kids started arguing. While we were comforting the other child, my daughter went into the kitchen, grabbed a kitchen knife, and threw it at the friend, nearly causing a bloodbath right then and there. She loves to see us panicking. The more we scream, the happier she becomes, clapping and laughing joyfully. As she grew older, she became more terrifying. Exhausted, my husband said, "Maybe we should have a second child." From behind the half-open door, a pair of sinister eyes stared at us. I initially thought I was having twins, which I took as a blessing from above. But when I went back for a checkup, there was only one fetus left. After the ultrasound, the gynecologist said the other embryo hadn't developed and had been absorbed. This is a normal occurrence. From the ultrasound, the remaining fetus is very healthy, so don't worry. "What do you mean it was absorbed? By whom?" I asked. The doctor paused and explained, "To put it simply, embryos that don't have the potential to develop or are weaker can't grow successfully. The human body is naturally more suited for single pregnancies. In twin pregnancies, they inevitably compete for nutrients, and the weaker one gets absorbed." But I pulled out my previous ultrasound reports. When I first found out, both embryos were clearly developing together, their heartbeats and sizes were similar. "I'm very sorry." After leaving the hospital, my husband comforted me, saying it was okay to have just one. I thought so too and tried to relax. Fearing that the fetus might mysteriously disappear again, I became very cautious. As the fetus grew, I started to feel unwell. I had severe morning sickness and was anemic. The doctor told me I needed to eat well to ensure the fetus developed properly. My whole family pampered me with rich food, but despite my efforts, I kept losing weight, making my belly look disproportionately large. During a follow-up check, the doctor noticed my condition was concerning because I was too thin and worried about the fetus's growth. But after the examination, they discovered the fetus was developing exceptionally well. No, it was thriving. It seemed like all the nutrients I consumed were being completely siphoned off by her. "The baby is growing too large. You must control your food intake and stop overeating," the doctor advised. I could see hesitation in her eyes. A woman as emaciated as I was should not have a fetus growing to such an outrageous size. It was simply abnormal. Indeed, the fetus's size was a problem. After returning home, I reduced my food intake, which often left me feeling hungry. Whenever I was hungry, the fetus would become extremely restless in my belly, as if throwing punches and kicks because it wasn't getting enough nourishment. A few days later, I fainted from anemia and was sent to the hospital. The doctor diagnosed me with malnutrition and prescribed nutritional injections. Checking the fetus again, it still measured larger than normal. "We'll schedule a cesarean." The doctor finally compromised, allowing me to resume eating. To find a balance, I only slightly increased my food intake, just enough to prevent the fetus from growing too large while ensuring my own survival. By the 7th month, I was emaciated, my cheeks sunken, limbs frail, and my belly enormous. I looked like a monstrous figure from a movie poster. I couldn't believe I was still a woman when I looked in the mirror. I knew pregnancy was a major life challenge, but I didn't expect mine to be so severe. To ensure the health of both myself and my child, I ended up being hospitalized. I had already quit my job 3 months into the pregnancy due to the unbearable symptoms, leaving my husband to bear the full financial burden. He cared for me deeply, working hard, and even taking on a part-time job. I begged countless times for my child not to continuously siphon off my nutrients, hoping we could all survive together. But the fetus didn't understand my words and continued to drain my life force, as if trying to suck me dry. Her greedy consumption led to repeated hospitalizations, leaving me feeling like a ghost and costing our family nearly 300,000 yuan. My mother-in-law came to take care of me and contributed some money as well. During the cesarean section, I lost a lot of blood and nearly died on the operating table. Finally, my daughter was born. Weighing 11 pounds, the doctor remarked that she was the largest baby he had ever delivered, even under the circumstances of my trying to limit my nutrition. Weakly lying in bed, looking at my daughter's adorable little face, I thought, all the suffering is finally over. Little one, you've given your dad and me quite a ride. From now on, you need to behave and we'll take care of you, I said, kissing her soft little face. She smiled at me. Although newborns can be quite unattractive, to me, she was the most beautiful angel in the world. I thought the hardships had ended, but little did I know, this was just the terrifying beginning. I had just completed the cesarean and was barely hanging on. After the anesthesia wore off, the pain at the incision was excruciating. My daughter was placed in the cradle beside my bed, and the nurse said I needed to have skin-to-skin contact with her, encouraging me to hold her more. It felt like a lot to ask of me. I could barely move, yet I desperately wanted to hold her. This feeling was strange. I don't know if other mothers feel this way. I knew I had a child, and I would love her, but that love felt somewhat abstract, as if it was more of an obligation. Because I'm a mother, I must love my child. But when the child was right in front of me, that deep-seated love became tangible. This child was the most important person to me, not dictated by books, ethics, or laws, but something instinctual that emerged from my very being. Wow! A cry came from the cradle. She must be hungry, my mother-in-law said with a smile, walking over to pick up the baby and placing her beside me. Being a first-time mom was a bit awkward. I asked my husband to pull the curtain around the bed before I clumsily unbuttoned my shirt to breastfeed. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through me, and I screamed. It felt like an animal had bitten me. My daughter, with her innocent and lovely face, was causing me so much pain. It hurts, I said when the nurse entered. That's normal, everyone has a different pain threshold. Some are more sensitive, and it's common to feel pain when breastfeeding at first, but you'll get used to it, the nurse reassured me. I felt a bit embarrassed. There was another woman in the room who had given birth the same day as I had, and she seemed very calm while breastfeeding. I asked her if it hurt. Just a little, but I can bear it, she replied. Having never been a mother before, I thought that was normal and tried to endure it. My daughter needed to feed often, with very short intervals. As soon as I placed her in the cradle, she would cry loudly. The middle-aged woman in the adjacent bed was not pleased and reminded me, if your baby's crying, just keep feeding her. My husband apologized and brought the baby back to me. As soon as she was settled, my daughter bit me, and I screamed again. Can you stop being so dramatic? The middle-aged woman snapped. Everyone's having babies and breastfeeding. Not everyone cries out like you do. The baby doesn't even have teeth. How painful could it be? My husband's expression darkened immediately. You don't have the right to criticize, he replied sharply. The middle-aged woman argued back. Your wife is disturbing my daughter. My granddaughter is perfectly well-behaved and sleeping soundly, while your baby is crying and disturbing everyone, making it hard for my daughter to rest. My husband clenched his fists, and I quickly said, Mujing. He turned and left the room, and soon after, a nurse transferred me to a private room. I felt bad about the expenses. My husband stroked my forehead and said, I recently took a part-time job and earned 10,000 yuan. It's enough for you and our daughter to stay in a good room. Mujing. I couldn't help but cry. It's strange, I didn't cry during the painful times of pregnancy, nor during the pain of the cesarean section, but I felt deeply moved by his words. They say having a baby can make you more sentimental, and perhaps that's true. My husband was incredibly attentive, busying himself with everything, while my mother-in-law, with her gentle nature, catered to my every need. Compared to other women in the hospital who argued because they hadn't given birth to sons or families that only cared about the child and neglected the mother, I felt incredibly lucky, so lucky that I even thought my cries while breastfeeding were a bit dramatic. After being discharged and returning home, my husband stayed by my side the entire time. If I hadn't asked him to hold the baby, he wouldn't have. I was a bit worried and cautiously asked, Mujing, don't you like girls? Did he feel upset about not having a son? He pinched my cheek and said, What nonsense. I love whatever you give me. I felt relieved. My mother-in-law showed no signs of favoring boys over girls, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of everything without a word of complaint. She was very understanding. It's hard to imagine that just a few years ago, she had lived a life of luxury, but after the family went bankrupt, she learned to clean and cook, handling life's difficulties with grace. I admired her for that. Our family was harmonious, and under the care of my husband and mother-in-law, I forced myself to endure the pain. However, after a few days, the areas I had been breastfeeding from became sore and infected. That's when my husband and mother-in-law finally realized that my cries of pain were not exaggerated, but very real. He immediately told me to stop breastfeeding and switch to formula. But my daughter stubbornly refused to take the bottle, insisting on breastfeeding. I felt like she didn't enjoy the milk, but rather liked biting me. My husband angrily told our daughter, "No more." He then resolutely stopped me from breastfeeding. The baby cried out in hunger, and I cried too, while my husband stood to the side, holding the bottle with indifference. We let her go hungry for a whole day until she reluctantly drank the formula. She wasn't just a hassle to feed, she was also restless. I couldn't sleep at all that night, and neither could my husband. He had to work the next day, and I suggested he sleep in the study, but he shook his head, wanting to be with me and not let me suffer alone. Even though he looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, he still radiated charm. He was very handsome. I consider myself pretty, but his features were even more refined. If he wore women's clothing, he would make me look like Cinderella. If it hadn't been for his family's bankruptcy and his father's troubles, I wouldn't have married him. Seeing me struggle, he hired a postpartum nurse. I said it wasn't necessary. I had already spent a lot of money during my hospital stays, but he insisted on hiring one for me. The nurse then told me that my daughter was the most difficult child she had ever cared for. As soon as my daughter was away from me, she cried. The nurse couldn't calm her down at all. I quickly dismissed the nurse and decided to care for the baby with my mother-in-law. After a few months, my daughter stopped waking up so frequently at night, and our family felt a lot more at ease. We bought her many toys, including a Barbie doll. When I returned from the bathroom one day, I found that the Barbies had been twisted off. Maybe the quality isn't great, my husband suggested, and he bought her other toys like a chick and a duck, all of good quality. But within a couple of days, the chick's wings were twisted off, and the duck's legs were pulled off. I began to sense something unusual about my daughter. Her interest in toys seemed to stem from a desire to dismantle them. When I mentioned this to my friend Zhou Yuan, who had a 1-year-old son, she said, "Kids are like that. Mine loves to take things apart too." Is that really the case? With no experience as a first-time mother, I thought this was normal. I took my daughter out for a walk in the neighborhood, where children were playing with colorful little chicks. My daughter was very interested, so I brought her over and said, "Look, baby, a chick." She giggled and reached for one, twisting its neck and breaking it instantly. It's normal. Young children have no respect for life and don't know their own strength. I shared this incident with Zhou Yuan and my mother-in-law, and they echoed the same sentiment. "Baby, you can't hurt little animals," I told my daughter repeatedly, trying to ease my concerns. She just giggled. Before long, my daughter turned 1, and her selfish nature became more pronounced. Anything that belonged to her, whether it was toys, food, or clothes, could not be taken by anyone. If something was taken, she would cry uncontrollably. Initially, we didn't pay much attention to it. Parenting experts and parents alike said that young children are inherently selfish. It's instinctual, and we were advised to cater to their wishes as much as possible until they were 2, to provide a sense of security. If we didn't, it could lead to personality issues as they grew up. So, we indulged our daughter. My husband made sure to spend time with her after work, showering her with love and attention within his means. When she was a bit over 1 year old, a friend had a baby and needed some old clothes. I packed up some of my daughter's old clothes and toys to give to my friend. I didn't think to hide it from my daughter, who would hide things from a 1-year-old. But when she saw me packing, she wailed and stumbled over to grab the toy from my hands, a toy she had previously discarded. I thought she might actually like it, so I put it down and grabbed another one. She came to snatch that one too. If I picked something up, she would grab it back. If I didn't, she'd wander off to play with something else. Seeing how much she cared about her toys, I went to the other room to gather her old clothes and put them by the sofa. When my friend arrived, I handed her the bag. Wow. My daughter screamed, rushing over to grab the bag and refusing to let my friend take it. We had to wait until she was distracted to grab it, but as soon as we did, she cried and eventually even hugged the bag, taking it to her little play area. No one could touch it. My friend left, helpless, and went to find clothes elsewhere. When I told my husband and mother-in-law, they didn't say much, thinking she would improve as she grew older. After all, we had to indulge her until she was 2. Well, I hoped she would change as she got older. Soon enough, my daughter turned 2, becoming increasingly selfish. During this time, we tried to teach her to share, but she refused. When playing with other babies, she wouldn't share her things and would often snatch from them. At 2 years old, my mother-in-law was feeding her at home. My daughter was eating a banana with child-sized chopsticks when my mother-in-law leaned in, saying, "Baby, can I have a bite of your banana?" Without waiting for my daughter's consent, she took a bite, and my daughter immediately shrieked, raising her hand and stabbing the chopsticks into my mother-in-law's eye. My mother-in-law cried out in pain, clutching her eye. I was stunned. This was the grandmother who had cared for her since she was born. She couldn't even take a bite of a banana without it ending like this. I rushed my mother-in-law to the hospital, where the doctor managed to save her eye, but her vision was significantly impaired. My mother-in-law, always gentle, insisted it wasn't the baby's fault and that it was just an accident. When my husband learned of the incident, he was furious and wanted to hit our daughter. My mother-in-law and I stopped him, believing we should guide her instead. To educate her, we tested her by taking her toys to teach her to share. My husband deliberately took her doll, saying, "Baby, can we give this toy to Daddy?" She screamed and grabbed the doll. My husband then brought out a small cake he had prepared to trade, but she still wouldn't agree. Eventually, in anger, she threw the doll on the floor and stomped on it, crying all the while. She would rather destroy her toys than let anyone else have them, even if it was her own dad. At mealtimes, if there was a dish she wanted, no one else could touch it. If we brought home fruits and she liked one, no one was allowed to eat it either. Otherwise, she would throw a fit, screaming so loudly that it could be heard throughout the entire building. No matter what parenting strategies we tried, nothing worked. She simply refused to share and was extremely selfish. Not only that, but she also lacked any empathy. I, my husband, and my mother-in-law were her closest people, always catering to her needs, yet she wouldn't let anyone take anything from her. When I fell ill and asked her not to cry, saying I needed to rest, she ignored me and continued to throw her tantrums. Perhaps it was simply because she was too young to understand. But even when she was 3 or 4 years old, she remained this way, showing no consideration for adults and no signs of concern at all. I was her mother. While playing with other kids, she often hit them because she wanted to snatch their toys. If she couldn't get them, she would throw herself on the ground and roll around in a tantrum. I had never taught her to behave this way, yet she had learned it on her own. While other parents worried about their children being bullied, I was constantly worried that my child would bully others. Since she frequently picked on other kids and never listened to reason, my mother-in-law and I reluctantly agreed to take a more forceful approach. After she hit another child once again, and someone came to complain, I lost my temper. I grabbed her hand and spanked her, telling her not to bully others or she would face consequences. She screamed and rolled on the ground, while my mother-in-law and I watched, determined to ignore her. She kept rolling around and making a scene, and I finally snapped, holding her hand and giving her 2 light taps, saying, "You're almost 4. Stop bullying others and don't cry all the time." My daughter struggled fiercely, shrieking loudly. When I let go of her hand, she ran to the coffee table, grabbed a fruit knife, and came at me with it. "I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you," she shouted as she swung the knife around. I was utterly shocked. Fortunately, children lack strength. I instinctively blocked with my hand, and the knife left a cut on my knuckles, causing blood to flow. My mother-in-law hurriedly took the knife away from her and held her. Even then, she was still screaming and crying that she wanted to kill me. After this incident, we dared not keep any knives in the living room. The image of my daughter shouting, "I'm going to kill you," while waving a knife left me traumatized. I specifically asked online, and everyone said this was called a curse sensitivity period. During ages 3 to 6, children may learn some bad words and misuse them, which usually passes as they grow up. My daughter had never cursed before, nor had she ever said anything like that to me. This was the first time. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive.